"You can't just bring a wild animal into the city," the wildlife control officer said into his radio. "We have protocols. Tranquilize it and transfer it to containment." Marcus Rodriguez froze behind the abandoned warehouse, watching through a broken window as officers surrounded the small leopard cub that had somehow wandered into downtown Phoenix. The cub couldn't be more than 6 months old, confused and terrified, backing against a chain-link fence with nowhere to run. What the officers didn't know was that this wasn't just any lost animal. This cub would change everything Marcus thought he knew about finding your way home. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The Sonoran Wildlife Rescue Center had been Marcus's refuge for the past 8 months. Not as a visitor, but as someone trying to disappear. After 3 tours in Afghanistan and a medical discharge that left him with a prosthetic leg and nightmares that wouldn't quit, the 34-year-old former Army Ranger had found himself unable to sleep indoors, unable to trust crowds, unable to explain to his family why he couldn't just get back to normal like they kept suggesting. His apartment in Tempe had become a prison of well-meaning but suffocating concern from relatives who didn't understand why he spent most nights in his truck, driving desert roads until dawn. The Wildlife Center sat on the outskirts of Phoenix, where the city gave way to scrubland and saguaro cacti. Marcus had discovered it during one of his sleepless drives, initially drawn by the simple fact that it was open 24 hours for emergency animal intake. The night security guard, an elderly Navajo man named Joe Begay, had found Marcus sitting in the parking lot at 3 in the morning, engine running, but going nowhere. Instead of asking questions or calling police, Joe had simply invited him inside for coffee and shown him the rehabilitation enclosures where injured desert animals recovered before release back to the wild. There was something about the center that felt different from every other place Marcus had tried since coming home. No one asked about his service. No one thanked him for his sacrifice, with that particular tone that made him feel like a museum exhibit. The animals didn't care about his prosthetic or his scars, or the way he sometimes flinched at sudden sounds. They were focused on survival, on healing, on the simple business of existing from one day to the next. It was the first place in 2 years where Marcus felt like he could breathe. Dr. Sarah Chen, the center's director, had eventually offered him volunteer work. Nothing official, just helping with basic maintenance and feeding routines during the night shifts, when his insomnia kept him awake anyway. Marcus discovered he had a natural instinct for working with traumatized animals. Perhaps it was recognizing something familiar in their wariness, their hypervigilance, their struggle to trust human contact again. The other volunteers noticed how even the most aggressive rescues would gradually calm around him, as if sensing a kinship in their shared experience of surviving things that left invisible wounds. The center housed everything from injured hawks and owls to abandoned coyote pups and the occasional mountain lion that had wandered too close to suburban developments. Each animal stayed only until it was healthy enough for release, except for a few permanent residents too damaged to survive in the wild. Marcus found himself particularly drawn to these lifers, understanding something about the weight of being forever changed by trauma, about learning to build a different kind of life when the old one was no longer possible. But even the Wildlife Center had its limitations when it came to exotic animals. Arizona's strict laws about non-native species meant that any big cats, primates, or other potentially dangerous animals that ended up in the state were quickly transferred to specialized facilities, often hundreds of miles away. The center simply didn't have the permits, insurance, or infrastructure to handle anything more dangerous than native wildlife. Marcus had learned this firsthand when they'd briefly housed an injured bobcat the previous month. Even that required special approval and round-the-clock monitoring until it could be moved to a facility in New Mexico, which made the presence of a leopard cub in downtown Phoenix not just unusual but almost impossible to explain. Leopards weren't native to North America, let alone Arizona. The nearest zoo was over an hour away, and none of the exotic animal facilities in the region had reported any escapes. Yet here was this young cat, clearly not fully grown, wandering through an industrial district like it belonged there. Marcus had first spotted it 3 days ago during one of his nighttime drives, a golden shadow moving between shipping containers near the railroad tracks. He'd thought he was seeing things, a flashback or hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation and too much caffeine. But when he'd returned the next night with binoculars, there it was again. A juvenile leopard, thin but alert, hunting pigeons and rats in the maze of abandoned buildings that sprawled along the freight yards. The cub moved with the careful precision of a wild animal, checking every shadow, every potential escape route, never staying in one place long enough to be cornered. It reminded Marcus of patrol tactics, the constant awareness that had kept him alive in hostile territory. The cub was surviving on instinct and intelligence, but survival wasn't the same as thriving. Marcus had called Dr. Chen, but without concrete proof, and given the improbability of the situation, she'd suggested he might be mistaking a large house cat or even a bobcat for something more exotic. The stress of his military service, she gently implied, might be affecting his perception. It was the kind of careful, therapeutic language that made Marcus's jaw clench with familiar frustration. Everyone seemed to think his problems could be solved with the right combination of medication, therapy, and positive thinking, as if trauma were a technical malfunction that could be repaired, rather than a fundamental change in how the world looked and felt. So Marcus had stopped calling and started watching instead. He'd set up observation points throughout the industrial district, learning the cub's patterns and routines. The young leopard had claimed territory in a section of abandoned warehouses scheduled for demolition, where broken windows and collapsed sections of roof provided shelter and multiple escape routes. It was smart enough to avoid the areas where homeless camps had been established, and clever enough to hunt primarily at dawn and dusk when human activity was minimal. The cub was adapting, but it was also clearly lost, searching for something it couldn't find in this landscape of concrete and steel. The wildlife control officer's radio crackled with static as he coordinated with his partner. Subject is cornered in Sector 7. Requesting backup and a containment unit. Marcus watched from his position behind a rusted shipping container as the team methodically closed off the cub's escape routes. The young leopard pressed itself against the fence, golden eyes darting between the approaching officers with their tranquilizer equipment. There was something heartbreaking about the way it held itself. Not aggressive, just terrified and confused, like a child who had wandered too far from home and couldn't find the way back. The officer raised his tranquilizer gun, and Marcus felt something snap inside his chest. Without thinking, he stepped out from behind the container. "Wait," he called out, raising his hands to show he wasn't armed. "Don't shoot it yet." The officers spun toward him, suddenly dealing with two unexpected situations instead of one. In that moment of distraction, something remarkable happened. The cub, instead of trying to flee through the gap in their containment, did something that would later puzzle everyone who heard the story. It moved toward Marcus. Not quickly, not aggressively, but with a deliberate, careful approach that suggested recognition rather than desperation. The young leopard stopped about 15 feet away, lowering itself into a crouch that wasn't defensive, but almost respectful. Its ears were forward, alert but not flattened in fear. The golden eyes fixed on Marcus with an intensity that reminded him of something he couldn't quite place. One of the wildlife officers started to raise his weapon again, but his partner grabbed his arm. "Hold on," the second officer said quietly. "I've never seen anything like this." Marcus slowly crouched down to make himself less threatening, keeping his movements deliberate and non-aggressive. The cub tilted its head, studying him with what looked like curiosity rather than fear. "Hey there, little one," Marcus said softly, using the same tone he'd learned to use with traumatized animals at the rescue center. "You're a long way from home, aren't you?" The cub's ears twitched at the sound of his voice, and, incredibly, it took another step closer. Dr. Sarah Chen arrived 20 minutes later, having received an emergency call about an, quote, incident involving one of their volunteers and an exotic animal. She brought Joe Begay with her, along with a portable containment crate and medical supplies. What she found defied everything she understood about wild animal behavior. The leopard cub was lying down in the gravel about 10 feet from Marcus, who sat cross-legged on the ground, speaking to it in low, steady tones. Neither human nor animal seemed distressed. If anything, they appeared to be having some sort of conversation. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "Marcus," Dr. Chen called out carefully, "I need you to slowly back away from the animal." But when Marcus started to move, the cub immediately stood up, its posture becoming tense and alert. The moment Marcus settled back into his sitting position, the cub relaxed again. It was as if the young leopard had decided that this particular human was safe, and it wasn't willing to let him leave. The wildlife control officers looked baffled. In 20 years of dealing with escaped exotic animals, they'd never encountered anything like this. Joe Begay studied the situation with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent decades working with both wild animals and traumatized people. "The cubs imprinted on him," he said finally. "Sometimes when young animals are separated from their mothers, they'll attach to the first creature that shows them kindness instead of fear." Dr. Chen frowned. "That's not how leopards work, Joe. They're solitary cats. They don't imprint like birds or social mammals." But as they watched, the cub began to exhibit behavior that supported Joe's theory. It started making soft, chirping sounds, the kind of vocalizations young cats use to communicate with their mothers. When Marcus shifted his weight, the cub adjusted its position to maintain the same distance, as if following some invisible tether. Most remarkably, when one of the officers accidentally kicked a piece of metal debris and created a loud clang, the cub's immediate response wasn't to flee. Instead, it looked directly at Marcus, as if checking for his reaction before deciding how to respond. Marcus felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced since before his last deployment. It was the feeling of being needed, not as a symbol or a victim or a problem to be solved, but as a source of safety for another living being. The cub's trust was complete and unquestioning, based not on what Marcus had been or what he'd lost, but on who he was in this moment. For the first time in months, the constant noise in his head, the hypervigilance, the self-doubt, the crushing sense of being broken, quieted to a whisper. Dr. Chen was coordinating with the wildlife control officers about transfer protocols when an unexpected voice joined the conversation. "That cub didn't escape from anywhere around here." The speaker was Elena Vasquez, a local news reporter who'd heard the police scanner chatter and arrived hoping for a human interest story. But Elena wasn't just any journalist. She specialized in wildlife trafficking investigations and had contacts throughout the exotic animal trade network. "I've been tracking a shipment of illegally imported big cats that went missing from a truck hijacking near the Mexico border 2 weeks ago. 3 adult leopards and 2 cubs. This little one probably walked for days, trying to find its way back to something familiar." The revelation changed everything. This wasn't an escaped zoo animal or an abandoned pet. This was a victim of wildlife trafficking who'd somehow survived on its own in one of the harshest urban environments in the American Southwest. The cub had been stolen from its natural habitat, transported hundreds of miles in traumatic conditions, then lost again when the criminals who'd taken it had their operation disrupted. It was, Marcus realized with a shock of recognition, a fellow refugee, a fellow survivor of circumstances beyond its control, trying to navigate a world that had suddenly become incomprehensible and dangerous. As if sensing his understanding, the cub made another soft chirping sound and took one more step closer. Now it was near enough that Marcus could see the dust in its whiskers, the small scratches on its paws from navigating urban debris, the way its ribs showed slightly through its spotted coat. This was an animal that had been surviving on pure instinct and willpower, just like Marcus had been doing since coming home from Afghanistan. 2 creatures both far from where they belonged, both trying to figure out how to exist in a world that felt foreign and threatening. The wildlife officers were growing impatient, concerned about public safety and departmental liability. But Dr. Chen found herself hesitating to give the order for immediate tranquilization and removal. There was something happening here that went beyond standard animal control protocols, something that might be important in ways she didn't yet understand. The tranquilizer dart would take effect in minutes, but those minutes felt like hours as Marcus watched the young leopard's eyes grow heavy and confused. Dr. Chen had made the decision after consulting with state wildlife authorities. Despite the unprecedented bond between Marcus and the cub, protocol demanded immediate containment and transfer to a federal facility equipped for exotic species. The cub fought the sedative's effects, trying to stay close to Marcus even as its legs began to wobble. When it finally collapsed onto the gravel, one paw stretched toward him, Marcus felt something break inside his chest that had nothing to do with his old war wounds. "We'll take good care of it," the federal wildlife officer assured him as they loaded the unconscious cub into a specialized transport crate. The facility in Colorado has excellent programs for rehabilitating trafficked animals. But Marcus had heard similar promises before, about how the VA would take care of veterans, how the system would help them transition back to civilian life, how there were programs and protocols for everything. He'd learned to recognize the careful language that sounded reassuring, while promising nothing concrete. That night, Marcus couldn't bring himself to return to the wildlife center. Instead, he drove aimlessly through Phoenix's empty streets, his mind replaying the moment when the cub had looked at him with complete trust before the tranquilizer took hold. He'd failed another mission, he told himself. Failed to protect something that had depended on him. The familiar weight of helplessness settled over his shoulders like a familiar, unwelcome coat. But something was different this time. Instead of the usual spiral into self-recrimination and isolation, Marcus found himself thinking about Elena Vasquez's investigation into wildlife trafficking. She'd left her card with Dr. Chen, mentioning that she was working on a larger story about illegal exotic animal trade routes through the Southwest. The next morning, Marcus called the number on the card. Elena met him at a coffee shop in downtown Phoenix, bringing a laptop full of research and a grim expression. That cub was part of something much bigger than a simple truck hijacking, she explained, spreading photographs across the table between them. We're talking about a network that's been operating for years, moving everything from baby jaguars to rare birds through Arizona to buyers across the country. The authorities know it's happening, but every time they get close to making arrests, the operation shifts location. Quote, the photos showed cramped transport cages, injured animals, and conditions that made Marcus's stomach turn. But what struck him most was how the animals looked. The same expression of confused terror he'd seen in the cub's eyes, the same wariness he recognized from looking in mirrors. How many animals are we talking about? He asked. Elena's answer was worse than he'd expected. Hundreds, possibly thousands, moving through the pipeline every year. Most died in transport, or shortly after arrival. The survivors were sold to private collectors who wanted exotic pets, or to unregulated facilities that operated under the pretense of conservation. The problem is documentation, Elena continued. By the time these animals surface in raids or rescue situations, they've been moved through so many hands that tracing their origins becomes impossible. The traffickers rely on that confusion. They know that overworked wildlife agencies don't have the resources to investigate every case thoroughly. She paused, studying Marcus's face. But you spending 3 days observing that cub before anyone else even knew it existed. That's the kind of detailed documentation that could make a difference. Marcus had filled 3 notebooks with observations about the cub's behavior, movement patterns, feeding habits, and apparent health status. What had started as a way to convince Dr. Chen that he wasn't hallucinating had evolved into a comprehensive behavioral study. He'd photographed the cub's territory, mapped its hunting routes, even collected samples of its scat for later analysis. Without realizing it, he'd created exactly the kind of evidence that wildlife investigators needed, but rarely had time to gather. Elena introduced him to Detective Ray Morales, who worked with a federal task force targeting wildlife trafficking. Morales was immediately interested in Marcus's documentation, but more importantly, he was interested in Marcus himself. We need people who can do long-term surveillance without being noticed, Morales explained. Someone who can spend hours or days in one location, observing and recording, without looking like law enforcement. Marcus's military background and his experience with the rescue center made him an ideal candidate for undercover observation work. The assignment would involve identifying and monitoring suspected trafficking routes through Arizona's vast desert landscape. It was dangerous work. The criminals involved were often armed and operated in remote areas where backup would be hours away. But for the first time since his discharge, Marcus felt like someone was offering him a mission that mattered. Work that would use his skills rather than accommodate his limitations. Dr. Chen was initially resistant when Marcus requested extended leave from his volunteer duties at the rescue center. You're making real progress here, she argued. The animals respond to you in ways I've rarely seen. Why throw that away to chase after something that might not lead anywhere? But Joe Begay understood immediately. The man needs to hunt, he said simply. Not for sport, but for purpose. Some people heal by staying still. Others heal by moving toward something important. The federal facility in Colorado wouldn't accept phone calls about individual animals, but Elena's contacts in the wildlife rehabilitation community provided updates about the cub's condition. It was healthy but refused to eat regularly, spending most of its time pressed against the back wall of its enclosure, avoiding human contact. The behavior was typical of trafficking victims, the facility staff explained, severe trust issues that often never fully resolved. Marcus found himself lying awake at night, thinking about those golden eyes that had looked at him with such confidence, wondering if that trust had been permanently broken. His first assignment came 2 weeks later. Intelligence suggested that a major shipment was being moved through a remote area near the Mexican border, using abandoned mining roads that were rarely patrolled. Marcus would establish observation posts and document vehicle movements, animal transport conditions, and personnel involved. It was exactly the kind of long-term surveillance mission he'd excelled at during his military service, but this time the enemy was different, and the stakes felt more personal. The night before he left for the border, Marcus drove past the industrial district where he'd first encountered the Cub. The area was already being cleared for development, the abandoned warehouses giving way to bulldozers and construction equipment. Soon there would be nothing left to show that a young leopard had ever tried to make a home among the shipping containers and broken concrete. But Marcus carried something with him now that hadn't been there before, a sense of mission that felt both familiar and entirely new. Marcus spent 6 weeks in the desert borderlands, documenting trafficking routes with the methodical precision that had kept him alive in Afghanistan. The work was solitary and dangerous, but for the first time since his discharge, the hypervigilance that had made civilian life unbearable became an asset again. Every shadow, every sound, every movement in his peripheral vision served a purpose. He was hunting again, but this time for justice rather than survival. The breakthrough came on a sweltering Tuesday in July. Marcus had positioned himself on a ridge overlooking a suspected transfer point when a convoy of unmarked trucks arrived at dawn. Through his scope, he watched as cramped cages were unloaded in the pre-dawn darkness. But among the terrified animals being transferred, he spotted something that made his heart stop. A young leopard, larger than before but unmistakable, with the same distinctive rosette pattern he'd memorized during those 3 days in Phoenix. The Cub had escaped from the Colorado facility 2 weeks earlier, according to intelligence reports that Marcus only learned about later. But instead of fleeing into the wilderness, it had somehow traveled over 400 miles to return to the trafficking route where its journey had begun. Wildlife experts would later struggle to explain how a young leopard could navigate such a distance through unfamiliar territory, but Marcus understood. The Cub was trying to find its way home, following some internal compass that pulled it back toward the only thing that had felt safe in its traumatic journey through human hands. What happened next defied every principle of undercover surveillance. Marcus should have maintained his position and continued documenting evidence. Instead, he found himself moving down the ridge, drawn by an instinct that overrode years of tactical training. The trafficking operation was in chaos as the Cub refused to enter the transport cage, snarling and backing away from handlers who were growing increasingly frustrated and violent. Then the Cub caught his scent on the desert wind. Its entire demeanor changed instantly, head lifting, ears forward, searching. When it spotted Marcus emerging from the scrub brush, the young leopard did something that the traffickers had never seen before. It came willingly, moving toward him with the same deliberate trust it had shown in that industrial district 2 months earlier. The traffickers were so shocked by the leopard's behavior that they failed to notice Marcus activating the emergency beacon that would bring the federal task force to his location. They were still staring in amazement when helicopters appeared on the horizon 20 minutes later. The raid netted the largest wildlife trafficking bust in Arizona history. 17 people arrested, 43 animals recovered, and evidence that would eventually dismantle a network spanning 3 countries. But the real miracle was quieter, witnessed only by a handful of federal agents and 1 news reporter who'd been embedded with the task force. As the chaos of arrests and evidence collection swirled around them, Marcus sat in the dust with the young leopard pressed against his side, both of them finally understanding what home meant. Not a place, but a recognition. Not safety, but trust. Not the absence of trauma, but the presence of something worth protecting. The Cub couldn't be returned to the wild. Too much human contact, too many learned dependencies, but neither could it remain in the sterile environment of a federal facility where it had been slowly dying of despair. The solution came from an unexpected source. Dr. Chen had been following the story through Elena's reporting, and she approached the wildlife authorities with a proposal. The Sonoran Wildlife Rescue Center could expand its facilities and obtain the necessary permits to house non-native species that couldn't be released. The cub would become an education ambassador, helping teach visitors about the reality of wildlife trafficking, while living in an environment designed around its specific needs. Marcus became the cub's primary caregiver, a role that evolved naturally from their unique bond, but more importantly, he became the center's first full-time anti-trafficking specialist, using his military skills and newfound expertise to train other wildlife facilities in surveillance and security. The work took him across the Southwest, but he always returned to Phoenix, to the rescued leopard that had taught him the difference between surviving and living. Elena's resulting documentary series won awards and changed legislation. Detective Morales' task force expanded into a permanent multi-state operation. Dr. Chen's facility became a model for trauma-informed wildlife rehabilitation. But the most profound change was in Marcus himself, who discovered that healing didn't mean forgetting the past or pretending to be unchanged. It meant finding purpose in the transformation, using what trauma had taught him to protect others who couldn't protect themselves. 6 months after the raid, Marcus stood outside the leopard's new enclosure at sunset, watching as the young cat practiced stalking techniques on enrichment toys. The leopard was healthy now, muscled and confident, its coat gleaming in the golden light. When it spotted Marcus, it approached the fence with that same deliberate recognition, pressing its massive paw against the barrier where Marcus placed his hand on the other side. A group of schoolchildren gathered nearby for the evening education program, their eyes wide as Marcus explained how this leopard had traveled thousands of miles, survived trafficking and abandonment, and ultimately helped expose a criminal network that had been operating for years. Sometimes, he told them, the most broken-looking things are actually the strongest. Sometimes what looks like the end of the story is really just the beginning. The leopard stretched and yawned, then settled into its favorite spot where it could see both the desert sunset and the human who had chosen to stay. Two refugees who had found their way home to each other, proving that family isn't always about where you come from, but about who chooses to stand with you when the world feels impossibly large and dangerous. If this story touched something in you, if you believe that everyone, human and animal alike, deserves a second chance at finding home, then I invite you to be part of this community. Hit that subscribe button and join thousands of others who believe that the most powerful stories are the ones where healing happens not in isolation, but in connection. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that being broken doesn't mean being worthless, that trauma can become wisdom, and that sometimes the most unlikely friendships are the ones that save us. Because every creature deserves to be seen, valued, and protected. And every story of rescue is really a story about the courage to believe that tomorrow can be different than today. Subscribe now, and let's keep telling these stories together. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work.